The rain came down in sheets that November evening, turning the streets into rivers and the sky into something dark and heavy. Dorothy Mitchell sat in her old station wagon at the red light watching the wipers struggle against the downpour. She was 58 years old and worked as a librarian at the county library, where she had spent the last 30 years helping people find the books that would change their lives or at least give them a few hours of peace. She lived alone now. Her husband Frank had passed 5 years earlier, and her daughter Emma lived 2 states away with a family of her own. Dorothy had learned to find contentment in small things. A good cup of tea. The garden she tended behind her little house. The satisfaction of organizing the children's section at the library just so. As the light turned green, Dorothy saw him. A man in military fatigue standing at the bus stop with no coat and no umbrella. The rain soaked through his uniform and he held a worn duffel bag close to his chest, trying to shield it from the weather. He stood perfectly still with the posture of someone accustomed to enduring difficult conditions without complaint. Dorothy felt something tug at her heart. Her own father had been a soldier. She remembered him coming home from Korea when she was just a little girl, and the way her mother had cried and held him in their front hallway while Dorothy watched from the stairs. Without thinking too much about it, Dorothy pulled over to the curb and rolled down the passenger window. The rain immediately began to spray into the car, but she did not mind. "Excuse me," she called out. "Are you waiting for the bus?" The soldier turned and Dorothy could see he was younger than she first thought. Maybe 40 or so, with kind eyes and exhaustion written across his features. He nodded. "Yes ma'am. Should be here in about 20 minutes according to the schedule." Dorothy shook her head. "You will catch your death standing out there." "Where are you headed?" "Over to the VA hospital on Riverside. I have an appointment in the morning and could not get a ride until tomorrow." "That is 15 miles from here." "Get in. I will take you." The soldier hesitated. "Ma'am, I could not ask you to do that. You do not know me. I am not asking for your permission. I am telling you to get in this car before we both drown." There was warmth in Dorothy's voice that made it clear this was not up for debate. A small smile crossed the soldier's face and he climbed into the passenger seat, bringing the smell of rain and something else. Weariness, perhaps. The kind that goes deeper than just being tired. "I am Dorothy," she said as she pulled back onto the road. James Crawford. "And I appreciate this more than you know." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. Dorothy had always been good at knowing when people needed to talk and when they needed quiet. James looked out the window at the rain and she could see his reflection in the glass. There was a sadness there that reminded her of her father in those early days after he came home. After a few miles, James spoke. "You did not have to do this. Most people would have driven right past." Dorothy kept her eyes on the road. "My father was in Korea. He used to say that the small kindnesses people showed him when he got home meant more than all the medals they gave him. I always remembered that." James was quiet for a moment. "I just got back 3 weeks ago. Afghanistan. Spent 15 months over there and now I am back and everything feels strange. Like I am in a place I should recognize but do not quite." Dorothy nodded. She had heard this before from the veterans who came to the library. "It takes time. More time than people think. You have to be patient with yourself. The VA has been helping. I have got an appointment with a counselor tomorrow morning. That is why I was heading there tonight. They have a program where you can stay overnight before early appointments." "Do you have family here?" Dorothy asked gently. "Not anymore. My mom passed while I was deployed and I was married once, but that did not survive the distance. I have got a sister in Florida, but we do not talk much." Dorothy felt that tug at her heart again. This man who had served his country was alone and trying to find his way in a world that had moved on without him. She knew something about that feeling. When they arrived at the VA hospital, Dorothy pulled up to the entrance. James reached for the door handle but paused. "Thank you, Dorothy. You did not have to stop, but you did, and that means something. You take care of yourself, James. And you keep going to those appointments. There is no shame in asking for help." James nodded and climbed out into the rain. Dorothy watched him walk through the doors of the hospital, and then she drove home through the storm, thinking about her father and all the soldiers who came home to a world that did not quite understand what they had been through. The next morning Dorothy was in her garden pulling weeds when she heard a car door close out front. She stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees, and walked around the side of the house. A military staff car was parked at the curb and two officers in dress uniforms stood on her front walk. Behind them was James, looking clean and rested in a fresh uniform. Dorothy's heart skipped. In all her years, the only time she had seen officers come to a house in dress uniform was to deliver bad news. The senior officer stepped forward. He was an older man with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent a lifetime in service. "Mrs. Mitchell, I am Colonel Raymond Foster. May we have a moment of your time?" Dorothy nodded and led them inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she offered coffee, which they politely declined. They sat in her small living room and Dorothy noticed James would not quite meet her eyes. Colonel Foster leaned forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, James here told us what you did for him last night. How you stopped in the rain and drove him all the way to the hospital when you did not have to." Dorothy waved her hand. "It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same. But they did not," the colonel said quietly. "James told us he stood at that bus stop for 45 minutes before you came along. At least 30 cars passed him by. You were the only one who stopped." James finally looked at her. "I did not tell you everything last night. I was not just going to a counseling appointment. I was going because yesterday I was not sure I wanted to keep going. The loneliness and the feeling of being lost were too much. I was standing in that rain thinking maybe it would be easier to just disappear." Dorothy felt tears spring to her eyes. "But then you stopped," James continued. "And you talked to me like I mattered. Like I was worth something. And you told me to be patient with myself. When I got to the hospital I checked myself in and told them I needed help. Real help. And they have been incredible." Colonel Foster pulled out an envelope. "Mrs. Mitchell, we do not have a medal for what you did. But the Army has a program called the Hometown Hero Initiative. We partner with veterans to give back to communities and to people who show extraordinary kindness. James requested that we help him do something for you." He handed her the envelope and Dorothy opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a check for $25,000. "I cannot accept this," Dorothy whispered. "Yes you can," James said firmly. "I do not have much, but I have my pension and some savings. The Army matched what I put in and added more. Please take it. Use it for your garden or travel or whatever brings you joy. You gave me my life back. Let me give you something in return." But there was more. The other officer spoke for the first time. "We also understand you are a librarian. The base library is looking for a part-time consultant to help with their veteran family support program. It is a few hours a week and it pays well. We thought you might be interested." Dorothy looked at these men in her living room and at James, who was watching her with hope in his eyes. She thought about her father and about Frank and about all the quiet years she had spent helping people find books and stories that would comfort them. "Why me?" she asked softly. James smiled. "Because you saw me. Not a uniform or a stranger or someone to be afraid of. You saw a person who needed help and you stopped. That is rare, Dorothy. That is precious." Over the following weeks Dorothy and James became friends. He started coming to the library on Tuesdays when she worked and they would talk about books and life and healing. She learned that he loved history and old westerns. He learned that she had always wanted to visit Scotland but never had the chance. With the money they had given her, Dorothy finally booked the trip to Scotland. But before she left she did something else. She used part of it to start a small fund at the library for veterans. Free books and a quiet room where they could meet and talk and know that someone cared. James helped her set it up. He brought other veterans from the VA hospital and slowly that room became a place of healing. They called it Frank's room after Dorothy's husband, and sometimes on quiet evenings Dorothy would sit in there and feel like everything had come full circle. On the day before Dorothy left for Scotland, James came to her house with a small gift. It was a book, a first edition of her favorite novel that he had somehow tracked down. "How did you know?" she asked. "You told me that first night. You said your father used to read it to you." I remembered. Dorothy hugged him and felt the tears come again, but this time they were different. They were not tears of loneliness or loss but of gratitude and connection. "You saved my life," James said quietly. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens from here on out I got to live it because you stopped in the rain." "We saved each other," Dorothy replied. "I did not realize how lonely I was until I had someone to care about again." That evening as Dorothy packed for her trip she thought about how strange and beautiful life could be. One moment of kindness. One decision to stop when you could have kept driving. That was all it took to change everything. She thought about her father coming home from Korea and how her mother had loved him back to life with patience and grace. She thought about Frank and the years they had shared. She thought about all the small kindnesses that make up a life and how they ripple out in ways we can never predict. The rain had brought James to that bus stop and her to him at exactly the right moment. Some people might call it coincidence, but Dorothy knew better. It was grace. It was the universe reminding her that we are all connected and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply stop and see another person's pain and do what we can to ease it. James found his way forward. He got the help he needed and started volunteering at the library. He reconnected with his sister and began building a life that felt worth living. And Dorothy discovered that her own life was far from over. She had purpose again. She had friendship. She had hope. All because she stopped in the rain and offered a ride to a stranger who turned out to be exactly the person she needed to meet. They had both been lost in their own ways and they had found each other at precisely the right moment. That is how grace works sometimes. Quiet and unexpected. A simple choice on a rainy night that opens up into something beautiful. A reminder that we are never too old and never too lost to start again. That kindness matters. That every person we meet is fighting a battle we know nothing about. And that sometimes the greatest gift we can give is simply to stop and say, I see you and you matter and let me help. Dorothy boarded her plane to Scotland with a light heart. Behind her was a library full of veterans who were finding their way. Beside her in spirit was James, who checked in every day to make sure she was safe and happy. And ahead of her was an adventure she had waited 60 years to begin. The rain had changed everything. But really it was not the rain at all. It was the choice to stop. To see. To care. That was what changed everything. That was what it always came down to in the end. Love in action. Kindness without condition. One person reaching out to another in the storm.